Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York in Bayside, Queens. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Today's talk is entitled Finding Home, Exploring the Cuban Jewish Experience in the Caribbean and U.S., and features writer and cultural anthropologist Dr. Ruth Behar. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center in Bayside, New York is situated on the traditional land of the Mantinecock people who continue to live here today. We offer gratitude and respect to all of the indigenous people of Turtle Island, past, present, and future, including the Lenape and Shinnecock peoples. What I just read is what we call a land acknowledgement. This is a statement recognizing that the land we all occupy in the course of our daily lives, including our schools, jobs, parks, and homes, as well as the names of towns and roads, were first inhabited by another group of people who were forcibly expelled and murdered. Today, we identify those crimes for what they are: mass atrocities and genocide. And these horrors continue to have devastating political, social, psychological, economic, and environmental impacts upon and within Native American and Indigenous communities. Today's event is part of the 2024-25 Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center and National Endowment for the Humanities Colloquium entitled Circuitous Exchanges. The event is organized by the KHC and is co-sponsored by the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan University, the Ray Walpole Institute for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at Western Washington University, the Holocaust and Human Rights Center in White Plains, and the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University. After the presentation, please be sure to submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And now to kick things off, please join me in welcoming one of this year's KHC NEH Faculty Fellows, Dr. Raquel Corona, doctoral lecturer in the English department here at Queensborough Community College. Dr. Corona began her time at QCC as part of the CUNY START program back in 2013 as an advisor and program coordinator, helping students adjust to college life. She received her PhD in English from St. John's University and her dissertation in rhetorical exploration of how transnationalism affects the circulation of stories about the Latinx women's body and sex. The years she spent as a student affairs professional supporting students outside the classroom in their pursuit of a college education have truly shaped her teaching pedagogy and commitment to student-centered and socially just teaching practices. Dr. Corona, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. I'm so excited to have this conversation. Welcome to our event, Finding Home. As a Latina myself, I've long held these questions about our idea of home and how it is informed by the past and the way our families have moved and navigated their lives traversing different countries. What happens even as we are born in a country different than our family's own, but our very lives encompass the ways of a place we may not have visited or lived extensively? What are the beliefs, the rituals, the traditions that are carried and passed along to each generation? And what does their relationship to a homeland look like as they begin to explore and excavate that history that their family has in moving across countries? And so today I'm excited to be joined by a scholar whose work is informed by her own family's journey from Europe to the Caribbean and eventually the US. Dr. Ruth Behar is a cultural anthropologist and a published children's book author who has spent her career studying and sharing her own personal experience navigating her identity as a Cuban Jew. Ruth has worked as an ethnographer in Spain, Mexico, and Cuba, and is known for her humanistic approach to understanding identity, immigration, and the search for home in our global era. Earlier this year, she published her middle grade novel, Across So Many Seas, which tells the story of 4 Sephardic girls in 4 different times and places, united by their desire to belong and to matter. She has written numerous works that I'm not going to tell you all about because she is extremely prolific, and they are both academic and fictional. And her commitment to exploring the Cuban Jewish identity is a really powerful one. She has been granted also numerous prestigious awards, some such as the MacArthur Foundation Award and the Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Award. And she is now the Victor Hein Pereira Collegiate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Michigan. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Ruth Behar, who's going to give you a sense of her research and her life's work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Corona. That was a really beautiful introduction. I'm really grateful for it and very, very honored to be here with all of you today. Thanks to everybody who's tuning in. So glad to be here. I'm going to give you a quick kind of history of my work and of the Cuban Jewish story, and then we will open it up to Q&A and discussion. So when you think about the Jewish presence in Cuba, you always have to ask, how far back should we go to understand this history? We could potentially go as far back as the conquest of the Americas in 1492 and Columbus, shown here down on one knee. And of course, there's continual debate as to whether he has any Jewish ancestry, but we do know that one of the people accompanying him on this journey, Luis de Torres, was a converso, was a Jew who had converted in that period in the 15th century, converted to Catholicism in order to be able to remain part of Spain and the Spanish people. So that much we know if we want to go way back and look at that very early colonial history. But for the most part, the Jewish community really forms in Cuba at the turn of the 20th century. And we have to think about the Cuban Jewish story in relationship to the Jewish American story, because there were many Jews that wanted to immigrate to the United States between World War I and World War II. But they couldn't do that because the United States established a quota system. And already at the very turn of the 20th century, they were concerned about all the immigration that had happened in the 19th century, a lot of Jewish immigration to the United States, but also Italian and other immigrants who came from Southern and Eastern Europe. So the United States in 1924 establishes an immigration act that essentially limits the number of people that can enter the US from Southern and Eastern Europe. And they have a quota system. And you can see that they had very low numbers for people coming from Poland and Turkey. And of course, many, many Jewish communities were in those places. So Jewish people trying to escape on the eve of World War II, on the eve of the Holocaust, found their way to Cuba, which at the time had an open door. And the first Jewish people to establish themselves publicly and outwardly as a Jewish community were American Jews in Cuba. Most people don't recognize that there was this important American Jewish community on the island. And the first institution that they established was a cemetery on the outskirts of Havana, which you see here in this picture. There was also a kosher restaurant, an American Jewish kosher restaurant in Havana called Moishe Pipik, also showing how that presence was important. But the majority of the Jews that came to settle in Cuba in the early 20th century were Jewish people from Poland and Russia, and from Turkey, Ashkenazi from Poland and Russia, and Sephardic from Turkey. And they found their way to Cuba in the teens and 20s and 30s, and even into the 40s during the war. So in my family, I have ancestry both from the Sephardic side and the Ashkenazi side. These are my Sephardic grandparents, whose ancestry goes back to Spain, to the expulsion of the Jewish community in 1492, and they met in Cuba, they met in Havana. They were both from the same town on the outskirts of Istanbul, a town called Silivri. And my grandmother, whose name was Rebecca, she had a very interesting story. She played this instrument, the oud that you see here, and she sang the old Sephardic songs in the Old Spanish. She was sent to Cuba by herself, by her parents, never saw her parents again, and started a new life in Cuba. So her life story was kind of mysterious, and that led me and inspired me to write a book that was inspired by her life, but also goes much further into looking at the Sephardic story. So we can talk about that later if we have time in the Q&A. So this grandmother got a book, and she and my grandfather were part of this Sephardic community that existed in Havana, and they formed a temple there, Shevet Achim, which curiously was located on the street of the Inquisitor in Old Havana. And so my other grandmother, my maternal grandmother and maternal grandparents were Ashkenazi. They were Eastern European. They spoke Yiddish. This was my grandmother, Esther. She went to Cuba by herself as well and met up with my great-grandfather, who was already there. She was from a town called Goworowo in Poland, and she left trying to help her family on the eve of the Holocaust, realizing that conditions were getting very bad in Poland. And she meets my grandfather in Cuba, and they marry. And my grandfather worked on the railroad in Cuba, met all of these immigrants, these Jewish immigrants that arrived from Europe to Cuba were penniless and started from scratch in Cuba. And he was very proud of the fact, my maternal grandfather, that he had worked on the railroad in Cuba. The majority of the Jewish men, when they arrived in Cuba, worked as street peddlers. And this was my great uncle, my grandfather's brother, and they just fanned out all over Cuba, selling whatever they could, shirts, cloth, buttons, whatever they had on hand that they could carry on their shoulders and backs. So my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, Esther, was able to reunite almost the entire family in Cuba, and they settled in the countryside of Matanzas. But she couldn't bring everybody to Cuba. There were relatives that didn't want to go to Cuba. This was my grandmother's grandmother, so my great-great-grandmother, and she was in Poland, and she didn't want to go to Cuba. She thought Cuba, from what she heard, was a jungle, and she chose to stay in Poland, and she, like so many others from that side of the family, perished in the Holocaust. So I wrote another book honoring the maternal grandmother, Esther, this book, Letters from Cuba, which is set in Cuba, and it's about a Polish Jewish girl helping her father to bring the family to safety in Cuba on the eve of the revolution, of the Holocaust. So here are my grandparents and my aunt and the little girl. The smaller girl is my mother. They settled in the countryside in Matanzas, and then eventually they were able to move to Havana, and they opened up a lace store, as you see here, a very small store with one employee. They lived above the store. And my mother, by that point, was about 8 years old and had only gone to school at a one-room schoolhouse in the countryside of Matanzas, and suddenly she was placed in a Jewish day school in Havana, because by this time the Jewish community was growing. By the 30s and 40s, the Jewish community was growing in Cuba, and particularly in Havana. They had a very strong Jewish community by this point, and had Jewish day school. So she was placed in a Jewish day school, which was really hard for her because she had to learn Yiddish, which she didn't know very well, having grown up in the countryside. So by the 50s, my family, like so many other Jewish Cubans at this point, start to be very prosperous in Cuba. They own small shops and stores. Some are major merchants, and they're doing fairly well in the community, in the Jewish community of Cuba. And my parents meet at this time in the mid-50s, and they come from two very different Jewish communities, which might seem odd to us today, but at that time, the Ashkenazi community and the Sephardic community were very separated from each other in Cuba, and it was very unusual for an Ashkenazi and a Sephardic person to date at that time, and in the case of my parents, to eventually marry. So I'm the product of this mix of Ashkenazi and Sephardic identity and culture, and we can talk more about that later. So here in the wedding, you see my parents with both sides of the family, including my great-grandparents. So my parents are looking to a new future in Cuba, planning to stay in Cuba. They had no idea in the mid-50s that they would be leaving, that the Cuban Revolution in 1959 would completely change their lives. They were part of a Cuba where there was a very close relationship with the United States, and you could literally take your car to the United States, to Cuba on a ferry from Key West. And so the tourist industry was quite important at that time, and there was a lot of U.S. tourism to Cuba at that time, so much so that the famous Tropicana nightclub even had a special teaser performance on the flight from Miami to Havana in the 1950s. And even the Jewish community was part of this. They had an ad here, as you can see, for the Tropicana nightclub, and it's in Hebrew and Yiddish. So just to give you a sense here with the map, you can see that by the 50s, there was a fairly large community of about 15,000 Jewish people living in Cuba, the majority in Havana, but definitely Jewish communities spread out all over the island, and synagogues in Santa Clara, Camagüey, Santiago de Cuba, and Guantanamo, plus Jewish communities in other locations as well. So showing that the Jewish community felt very comfortable in Cuba in this period. The majority were Ashkenazi Jews, but there were also an important percentage of Sephardic Jews. And by the 50s, they are feeling that they're going to stay in Cuba for a very long time. They build a community center. As you can see here, these are the plans for the center with a beautiful arch, pointing up to the sky, and again suggesting this presence that's going to be long lasting. And the Jewish community connected very much with Cuban history, and particularly the presence of José Martí, the great independence leader who crafted this very beautiful poem about cultivating a white rose for a friend, but also for an enemy. And it's a poem that children in Cuba memorize and learn in school. But curiously, José Martí, though very, very Cuban in his attitude, lived in exile for many years, and in fact wrote that poem in upstate New York in the Catskills. This image kind of evokes that. And then interestingly, the Jewish community was very, again, connected to Martí and to the Cuban story of seeking independence. And a Jewish writer wrote a poem honoring Martí. It was actually written originally in Yiddish and then translated into Spanish. And here I have it in English: "Blessed land, singing amid sugarcane and tobacco, to its rising paradise." So just to show you how comfortable the Jewish community was in Cuba in this period, and really expecting to be part of Cuba for generations to come. They had a major event honoring Martí in 1954. And I was part of all of this as a very young child. Here I am with my mother on the famous Malecón, the seawall that runs along the edge of Havana. We lived very close by and would go there often. And we were also very close to the Jewish Community Center, to the Patronato, as we call it, just half a block away. So we passed by often, and I was photographed in front. There was a park nearby that I've been to many times. Here I am with my parents. And then everything changes with the coming of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, when Fidel Castro comes to power. And the Jewish community initially is very supportive of the revolution, as most Cubans are at this time. I'd say 90%, 90 to 95% of Cubans support the revolution and are expecting an important democratic change because they had had a dictator, Batista, up until this period. So there was great hope for the positive changes that the revolution would bring to Cuba. So the Jewish community in particular wasn't thinking that they would leave immediately at all. And Rabbi Gambach, who was also a friend of the family, in 1960 publishes a Haggadah de Pesach, a Passover Seder Haggadah. And it's 1960, it's a year after the revolution, and clearly there's still this sense that the community is going to remain in Cuba. And I myself was sent to the same school that my mother was sent to, where instruction was in Spanish and Yiddish. And I just want to show you that my mother somehow had the presence of mind to hold on to this uniform that I wore, and she brought it with her in our suitcase when we left Cuba. So just to show you that I have this uniform that I wore when I was probably 4 years old. So that connection is still there. But then the community, many people in the community, my family included, decided to leave. Many left in 61, 62, after Fidel Castro declared that the revolution would be communist and that properties were nationalized, and people who had stores, for example, lost their stores and they became part of the state, essentially. And so many felt threatened by that, economically threatened in particular, not in any way threatened as Jewish people, but as people of the middle class, essentially. And many chose to leave at that time. And that's the time when my family chose to leave. My grandmother is shown here, leaving Cuba. And the majority of the community goes to Miami with the rest of the Cuban diaspora that leaves at this time. And they form a Cuban Hebrew social circle in Miami, as you can see here. And they remember that synagogue, that community center that they built in Havana, where they were planning to stay for many generations. So they bring that memory, that nostalgia with them to Miami. And just to show you just some of the people that formed this community, Ophelia, who was a major administrator of the community, knew everybody in the community. You can see she's got the Cuban and the American flag there on her desk. Some of the interesting characters too in the community. This man who was a shoe repairman, and he had this wonderful sign at his store, Se habla Yiddish, right? So again, showing this mix of Spanish and Yiddish. And Bernardo Benes, who was an important figure as well, and he came up with this Cuban, this term that the Jewish Cubans use to name themselves to this day. And he negotiated with Fidel Castro for the release of political prisoners back in the day. And then there's another temple formed by the Sephardic Cuban community, also in Miami, Temple Moses, as you can see here. And you can see what they say in the plaque that's at the entrance to the synagogue. We will never forget what we left behind on the island of Cuba. So again, this very, very strong connection to Cuba. The women make borrecas, bulemas, and which they sell to support the community. The men play dominoes just as men do in Cuba to this very day. And there's a cemetery in Miami where many people in the Cuban Jewish community are buried, and among them Marcos Behar, who's not my relative, but I was very taken by this tombstone with the domino pieces left there in memory of his love of domino. So we end up settling in New York. So unlike the majority of the community that settles in Miami, there's a smaller community that settles in New York, and we go to live in Queens, actually, initially in Briarwood. That's my mother and my aunt, and this is our first home in the United States. This building near PS 117, where I went to elementary school, and discovering snow, which was a huge discovery for us, obviously having grown up in the tropics. And I was very aware of how my mother and my grandmother held on to traditions via food. My mother would make Cuban food. My maternal grandmother in particular would make Yiddish style, Jewish style food. And this here is the recipe for gefilte fish written out in Spanish, but the fish are named in English because she had to go to the fish store, request the fish in English, but the recipe was in Spanish. And then my mother would make frijoles negros, black beans, a very important dish in Cuban cuisine. So kind of grew up with these different food traditions, which let me know that I had these different traditions in my ancestry. So I started returning to Cuba in the early 90s. As an anthropologist, I was really curious to see who remained in the community. I knew that some people had remained, that there were also many people who were Jews by choice, who had converted and become part of the community. So I was really curious to learn about this community. And as an anthropologist, we go and connect with communities directly. And so that was what I wanted to do. And I started traveling to Cuba. Initially, I was just kind of trying to stand in the same places where I had stood as a child and see if I could reconnect with everything that had been left behind by my family. I initially made a documentary film about the Sephardic Jews of Cuba, and I was going to Cuba in the 90s, and that was a time when lots of people were leaving Cuba. It's very similar to now, actually, when lots of people are leaving the island because of all the difficulties that they're going through right now with electricity and food shortages and so on. And it almost seemed as if the entire island had become a balsa, had become a raft at that time. So I made this film honoring my father, who does not want to return to Cuba, not even to see it. He just doesn't want to go there anymore. He wants to hold on to the memory of Cuba that he has. But I wanted to honor his Sephardic story, his Sephardic ancestry. And so I filmed him and my mother in New York. We went to the cemetery in New Jersey where my grandparents, my paternal grandparents are buried. And this section of the cemetery is called Shevet Achim, just like the synagogue that they went to in Cuba, back on the Street of the Inquisitor. And as part of my research, I met a lot of interesting people in the Sephardic community, many of them of mixed identity, like Danaida, shown here with her father, who's biracial. She has a Black mom, a Sephardic dad, and he was teaching her how to chant Torah for her bat mitzvah back at that time in Cuba. She eventually left Cuba and resettled in Israel with her, and she had two daughters, as you see here. And then another person shown in the film, interviewed in the film, is this young man at the time, Miguelito, who loved to drum, and then eventually he also left for Israel as a young person and started a new life there with his mom and his sister. After that project, I decided that I wanted to explore the Jewish community more broadly, the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi community, and travel all over Cuba and get to know all the Jewish people that I could get to know who were living on the island at that time. And so that led to this book, An Island Called Home, also in Spanish, Una Isla Llamada Hogar. It's in both languages. And so I interviewed Adela Dworin, who was the president of the Jewish community and a very important figure in the community. And you see her here at her desk. There's a library at the Patronato, at the synagogue, the Jewish Community Center Synagogue. And you can see the Jewish Star bookshelf there, and then a bust of Jose Martina Menorah. So again, this kind of mix of the Jewish and the Cuban, which is so much a part of my identity. I often say that I am Jewish because I'm Cuban, that if Cuba had not accepted my grandparents, I wouldn't be here. So my Jewish and my Cuban identity are so interwoven, and we can see that kind of interweaving in this picture right here. So it's been really interesting, and has been very interesting, to go back to Cuba, to go back to the places that were a part of our lives when I was a little girl, and then seeing all the ways in which people have tried to support and help this community of about 1,000 Jews who still live on the island of Cuba. Many go to the Patronato itself almost as an act of pilgrimage to connect with the Jewish community and the memory of the Jewish community on the island. As you see here, the inside the synagogue. Many go to that cemetery that I showed you at the very beginning as part of a trip to understand the Jewish presence in Cuba. And these are some men in the Orthodox synagogue in Havana, as well, Adath Israel, and it almost looks as if Che Guevara is inside the synagogue, the back of this man's t-shirt. And I was really struck by how people, through all those decades of revolution, had held on to Jewish memorabilia, whether it was a kippah or a talit. I found that so striking. They never forgot, even if atheism was enforced in Cuba in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. In the 90s, the Cuban government opened up and basically said that people could have a religious identity and be members of the Communist Party, that there was no contradiction. But in the decades before, it had been very, very difficult to practice any religion in Cuba. But I was so impressed that people had held on to these important symbols of their Jewish identity, including a ketubah in this case. And Sarah showing me the photographs of the Les Quinceañera celebration that was held at the Patronato in 1959. And she said, of all the women in the picture that you see there, who were all 15 in 1959, she is the only one who has stayed in Cuba. And it was very, very touching and moving to meet Jaime Gans Green, who's no longer with us, who lived in Palma Soriano, a small town all the way on the eastern end of Cuba, and a very solitary man, but he had such a rich, imaginative life, and showed me letters in Yiddish from family in Europe, and also had this very chilling postcard sent apparently from a concentration camp with the Hitler stamps on it. So that was quite an amazing experience to meet him. And this Jewish community in Cuba about 20 years ago became a community that many people were fascinated by. And so that was very interesting. Steven Spielberg was in Cuba and felt so proud to be a Jew after seeing how this community had been able to stay alive through the years of the revolution. This little boy, now grown up, Moishe, was shown here, showing a picture of himself with Spielberg. And here he is now, grown up with his dad, David Prinstein. And it was intriguing to me that the Cuban government noticed the interest in the Jewish community, and they built a Jewish-themed hotel, the Hotel Raquel that you see here, which is in the old part of Havana. And each of the rooms of the hotel are named after Old Testament figures, and there is a Ruth room. And so when I went there years ago, I stayed in the Ruth room and wondered, ironically, if all that's left for me in Cuba is a hotel room with my name. So it's a community that many continue to find interesting to explore for very good reason. And the community continues to evolve and change. And they have a Holocaust exhibit in the Sephardic synagogue in Havana. They're much more involved now in Holocaust consciousness than they were 20 years ago, as you can see here. And these are all people involved in Jewish education in Cuba, particularly in Havana. They have a Jewish day school that runs on Sundays, and they have schooling for kids and for adults as well, adult learning as well. And this is back at Adath Israel again at the Orthodox synagogue, where the women make various kinds of Jewish handicrafts for sale to visitors. And a couple of years ago, before the pandemic, they had a big Hanukkah party at the Jewish Community Center at the Patronato, and it was a big also interfaith event, and they wanted to reach out to people of different religious backgrounds and show them how they celebrate Hanukkah. So this is very, very, very powerful moment. You can see this enormous Cuban flag there. And it was striking. There were people in the community that kind of became characters in the community, and this man Salomon was one of them, who I knew very well from all my years of traveling to Cuba. He even appeared in an article in the New York Times that he's holding up here, and he became so much of a character because he was always asking the various visitors for help, for money, for whatever they could do to support him. And so he kind of became a character in the community. And at this Hanukkah event, they put on a skit, and they basically, so this Abelito acted as Salomon, just to remember and honor him. So it was a very sweet moment. And they continued to give a lot of attention to Israeli dancing, as you can see here. And the communities in the provincial cities continue to exist. They're very, very small now, but there's still communities in Santa Clara, where David Tacher is from. This is the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery in Santa Clara, and he built a Holocaust memorial in the cemetery. And school children are brought there to see this and to understand this history, which is very important and powerful. They built a new synagogue in Santa Clara. They had an old one that had to be given to the government because no one was using it in the years of the fiery years of the revolution. And so they built a new synagogue with these symbols that you see here, the island and the menorah and the star. And then this is the community in Guantanamo, and several of the people in the picture are now living in Israel, but at the time they were still in Cuba. There are still some people in the Guantanamo Jewish community still there. And this photograph to show you from a Purim party, where you can see the range of girls, all of them being Queen Esther, and being part of the Jewish community. And I'll just end with this picture. This is from my last trip to Cuba in 2020, where I gave a talk and got to converse with the young adults in the community in Cuba. So I'm going to end there to be sure that we have enough time for discussion. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Behar. And I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Corona to lead off the Q&A.
Yeah, so if you're with us today and you have a question, definitely put it in the Q&A box, and I'm going to get us started with one or two questions while we wait for all your inquiries too, because we want to make sure that Ruth gets to any questions that you may have. My first question for you, Ruth, is one, before I get to my questions, thank you so much for sharing that beautiful sort of like greater context and journey. And I loved being able to see the commitment to like considering artifacts and connection to family, even as you move. And even there's a whole conversation in there too with folks going to Israel as well, that also being the place of people moving. And so my first question is for you, as you have committed almost like your life to this sort of excavation and history of your family, um, how did that feeling of home shift or change for you, or perhaps even like evolve the more you conducted research and like visited Cuba?
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, I was traveling very frequently to Cuba in the 90s and the 2000s, and up to about 4 years ago, up until basically the pandemic. And those trips to Cuba were extremely important. I think the reconnecting to the culture, to the language, and to the people. I met lots of artists and writers in Cuba, and they were very inspiring to me and encouraged me. I was writing poetry because the experience of being back in Cuba was so emotional. And the fact that my parents didn't want to go, but that I was going kind of for them in a sense was very emotional. And I was writing a lot of poetry, and I was encouraged by friends there to keep writing and to write in Spanish as well. And so I started writing my poems in English and then creating Spanish versions of them, not exactly translating, but creating the Spanish version of the same poem. So that was very, very important to me, kind of like, going into my artistic soul, like not just my anthropology role as professor and scholar, but going into kind of another level of who I am. And so discovering the poet and the fiction writer was very important. Discovering, the role of the imagination, that there were certain things I could find through my research, and then other things I couldn't find, and I had to find them through this artistic path, we might say. So that was very important to me, and I think it gave me like a much deeper sense of home. It was like coming full circle. This is the place where I was born. I was able to find people there that were, welcoming to me, both in the Jewish community and beyond the Jewish community. That was really important, finding a sense of place there. But then also, as now as I've grown older, I've found more and more of a sense of home in my writing and in the stories that I'm creating. In fiction, for example, having written these two books, one about each grandmother, I feel like I've given each of them a place in history, in a sense, that kids, because these books are for young adult readers, that kids will read about these two girls, that were my grandmothers, and get a sense of this kind of larger history, this identity that is Jewish, that is Latina, that is Spanish, that is like this mix of so many things, and that hopefully that kind of opens a door for young people to think about identity in a much broader and bigger way, as opposed to these very simplified boxes. So I feel like I'm thinking about home in this broader sense now that I have multiple homes. New York, is very much a home for me since I grew up in New York. And every time I go to New York, I live in Michigan now, but when I, go to New York, it's like, wait, this is home. But then I also feel a connection in Miami, where part of my family lives as well, and where the Cuban community, has formed, such a strong enclave there. So I also kind of feel sometimes, Miami feels as close as I'll get to Cuba in the United States. And then many people that I've met in Cuba have eventually left Cuba and settled in Miami. So there's all of these really interesting circles of identity. And I've also, as you said, have lived in Spain and Mexico, feel connected to those places as well, where I spent several years of my life. So I think now I'm in this setting where it's like multiple homes, but probably the home that now anchors me the most is the home that I'm creating in my writing.
Thank you so much. That's really beautiful to consider too, with the idea that it's the writing, but the writing always takes you to all these different places that you
Yeah.
can explore with home that are also connected to people, right? Because the writing is so focused um, on like exploring those people's stories and having those out there for people of various ages to be able to take in, right? Because you do your children's sort of work, but there's also all this like really wonderful memoir work that you do,
Mm.
that I feel like is getting at so many different people at different ages, right? To hear this powerful story about identity. I wanted to see if Dr. Cohen wanted to take some of these questions because these are really good. So I didn't want to jump into any other ones because there's some good ones in here.
Thank you so much. Someone has commented on how your presentation really reminds them a lot of their family. And as we spoke initially, your story, Dr. Behar, is very much my family story. And my mom is on the call and some other relatives. And, being connected to El Patronato, and my uncle, who was actually born and raised there, was bar mitzvah at Adath Israel. And the connection to Miami is very strong. So thank you, because I feel like it's really significant in a way to talk about all these different interconnections, especially at this moment where in our society, we're spending a lot of time focusing on the different aspects of our identities, but not necessarily always thinking about how they come together and their interconnectedness. And there are some really wonderful questions. So I wanted to ask from a scholarly perspective, where do you see the future of research about Cuban Jewish history going? And for those folks that are on the call who are scholars, what resources do you recommend that they connect to?
Well, that's such a great question. Well, I think there's so much still to do, both from an anthropology perspective, so more ethnography, and there's many more, interviews and oral histories that we can collect at this time. I'm actually working on another project on the Cuban Jews in Miami, a project that I started over 15 years ago, and I'm working on this with a photographer. So hoping to get moving on that project again, starting next year. There's so much to do in collecting the stories in Miami of the Cuban Jewish community. So that's definitely something that I want to do. And the same in Cuba. There's many more stories to collect. And then also, as was mentioned, some people in the community have left and started a new life in Israel, and that community would be very interesting to study as well. The community of those that left Cuba for Israel and then eventually resettled in Miami. So they made this kind of long journey. And there's quite a few who form part of that community in Miami right now. So definitely in terms of oral history, like a big oral history project would be really wonderful to do from an anthropology perspective. And then from a historical perspective, I think there's lots of documents that still could be consulted in Cuba. The Patronato has some documents that could be consulted, and beyond. I think there's lots of documentation, the documentation of the American Jewish presence in Cuba as well. And then just the role of the Joint Distribution Committee and helping the Jewish community in Cuba. As of the 90s, the JDC has been very, very involved in helping the community to revitalize. That was a very significant historical moment. So that could be studied in detail. So there's quite a lot to do, and I'm sure the historians on the call will know more about specific archives and resources to look at. But I think there's much to study still. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a few, I think, just on a practical level, because I think the first three questions are asking this. How does it work for people to leave Cuba now? Can, for example, people who are in Cuba, Cuban citizens, go to Israel freely? Could they come to the States? And what are sort of the parameters for people who want to go back and explore their roots if they're American citizens trying to go back?
Well, it is my understanding that Jewish people in Cuba can still make Aliyah to Israel, and that Israel supports those migrations. I mean, it's possible for people to do that because they get support from Israel. Israel pays for the passports, pays for the travel, provides housing for the first year in Israel, provides Hebrew education. So a lot of people have been able to leave with that support. Most people don't have the financing to be able to leave in any other way. It's much harder to get into the United States, so many people choose to go to Israel instead, and some do stay in Israel and become part of the Israeli nation, and then others find that they can't quite adapt. They're missing the Spanish language, etc., and so then they find their way to Miami. And in terms of traveling to Cuba, it is possible to travel to Cuba from the United States. There are several legal categories that you can choose, among them educational travel, research travel, visiting family, even going to, say, a jazz festival is a legal way to travel to Cuba. So there are many ways to travel, and there are commercial flights from Miami and I believe from New York as well, and possibly from LA. I know that many of these flights existed in the past, but I think they're back up and running again. But I just recently saw that there were several flights from Miami to Havana. So it is possible to go independently if you fit into any of those categories of travel. The one thing we're not allowed to do as American citizens is travel to Cuba as tourists. That's the one category that isn't possible. A Canadian can go to Cuba as a tourist, but not an American. So that's a big difference. But if you can just plan to go on an educational mission or a humanitarian mission, those are all legal ways to travel to Cuba. And then Cuba itself doesn't have any problems with Americans entering the island.
That was definitely my experience also. And we can put in the chat for everybody a link, at least for the travel guidance. And I wanted to ask you, because in our previous conversation, I mentioned I was in Cuba in March of this year, and I went to both cemeteries, the Ashkenazi cemetery and the Sephardic cemetery, and there were Holocaust memorials in them. And the Ashkenazi one, there's the one that talks about the connection to the soap myth, and then there are two in the Sephardic cemetery. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the significance of those and how those got there.
Yeah, I don't know that much about them. I do know that the one in the Ashkenazi, as it's called, the Ashkenazi cemetery, it's really the United Hebrew Congregation Cemetery. That was the one that was founded by the American Jewish community in 1910. So that I know, I believe it's one of the first Holocaust memorials in Latin America, if I'm not mistaken. So I know that much about it. I don't know that much about the two memorials in the Sephardic cemetery. I think we'll have to call on the historians to help us with that. I don't know the whole story behind them, but it is interesting that there are two cemeteries, and that people think of them as the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic, because in fact there are Sephardic Jews buried in the what's called the Ashkenazi cemetery, but the Sephardic cemetery was built after the Ashkenazi cemetery, and it was built. I mean, the initiative was a Sephardic initiative, but I believe that anybody can be buried there regardless of their background.
Thank you. Dr. Corona, do you want to take the next question?
Sure. So I have one question because I had my students in my introductory literature course read a couple of your short stories from the memoir Traveling Heavy, a memoir in between journeys. So I had them look at Bissell and A Sephardi Air. And in those stories, we see this like really wonderful, I think, teenage girl trying to navigate these varying beliefs and expectations of family, both in regards to like her identity, but also like the way she navigates encounters in this new country with values that are not necessarily of that country. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what it means to attempt to reconcile like these varying and opposing beliefs and ways of being as you're growing, right? And you're trying to develop your own identity.
Thank you. That's such a beautiful question. Yeah, so in these two essays, so in A Sephardi Air, I'm trying to understand how I came to know that I had Ashkenazi and Sephardic identity, since neither side of the family went around saying I'm Ashkenazi, I'm a Sephardic, but I got the sense that they were different from the time I was a child, whether it's different food traditions on my mother's side and my father's side, but also kind of hearing like what one side of the family thought about the other. The Ashkenazi side called the other side the Turcos, and so they were the Turks, and then sometimes if I was too willful, then my Ashkenazi grandmother would say, well, you're like the Turks, you're like the Turcos, and so sort of suggesting that having a bad temper was kind of a Sephardic trait. So I was just trying to kind of understand, how as a young person do you come to understand what these different identities signify. And in particular, in that story, I reflect back on Passover and the Seder the first night and the Seder the second night, and how in my child's mind I thought, well, the first Seder was the important one because it's the first, and that was the one that we went to on, was my mother's side, the Ashkenazi side, seemed like that was the important one, the one where we ate gefilte fish and matzo ball soup. That was that was the first, so that was somehow more important. And then the second Seder was the Sephardic one, and there the cuisine was so different, and the traditions were so different, and trying to understand that. And then also I tell the story of my brother's name and how Sephardic Jews have the custom of naming, newborn children after a living relative, and Ashkenazi Jews have the tradition of naming a child after a deceased relative. So when my brother was born, my Sephardic grandparents wanted him to be named Isaac, just like my grandfather, and my mother couldn't understand how that was conceivable, since you don't name children after a living relative. So just kind of like seeing how these different customs, clashed in the family, how they were all Jewish, but there was different ideas of what Jewishness was and how to practice Jewishness, and just trying to understand how I came to make sense of these different identities and to make them all part of my own identity. And then in El Beso, in that story, which takes place in Miami, and I'm a little older, and interested in boys and so on by then, a young teenager, and it's Miami, and you're sort of a little freer. We're not home anymore, we're on vacation, and I have this little fling with a boy who's Puerto Rican, and this is something that once my mother finds out, she finds this terribly upsetting, and I don't understand why, because if we're Cuban, what's wrong with me having a boyfriend who's Puerto Rican? And so they're kind of being reminded, no, you're Jewish, and you're not to date anybody or see anybody, any boys that are not of your religious background. So just how those different ideas were communicated to me, and kind of what I understood and what I felt I could and couldn't do. What were the limits of what I could and couldn't do? Who could I relate to? Who could I not relate to? And just thinking about things like that, interracial and in relationships, and interethnic relationships, and so on, and how that all was made clear to me at that time by having this clash with my mother at the time.
I think one final question, and then I'll have Dr. Cohen come on in. So I'm assuming a lot has changed in the last 20 to 30 years as you've been sort of exploring your identity as a Cuban and a Jewish woman. What would you say, or share with us about how your perspective has changed from throughout that time, from like clearly some of the stories that you were talking about in the memoir until like now?
Yeah, I just feel that now I just know so much more. When I was starting to investigate Cuban Jewish identity, maybe I had a more superficial perspective, but now I have not only my own perspective and what I've, gained over the years as I've read more and connected with more people, but I also know more about the communities. I know more about the community in Cuba. I know about the community in Miami, a little bit about the community in Israel as well. But I just have a much broader sense of, I guess, different subjectivities and different ways that people think about their identity, and different ways in which we're hybrid, I guess, different ways in which Jewishness and, let's say, Latino or Latinx identity come together. I feel like I have a broader sense. I know people now of different Jewish Latinx backgrounds, whether it's Chilean or Mexican or Argentine. So I also Mexican. I mean, I have this like a broader context now for seeing my identity as not, in and of itself, and solitary, but rather connected to all these different migrations to different parts of Latin America and the Caribbean and different parts of the United States as well. There are many more Jewish, Latino people living in the United States now than there were, say, when I was a young woman starting to explore this topic. Like even in Miami, you find not just Jewish Cubans, but Jewish Venezuelans, Jewish Argentines, etc. And so now it's an identity that I can see in a much broader light than I was able to when I was starting.
Thank you so much.
Thank
I don't
you.
know, Dr. Cohen, if there are other questions you want to be able to
Yeah, I'm actually, before we close, I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to, you've talked about sort of your identity as a Latina person, and in the chat, I'll put in a moment an organization called Jutina, which is very much about this. I'm curious in this moment, around the world, and especially in the United States with the rise in anti-Semitism, has that impacted your identity as a Jewish person? And do you have any other insights regarding how anti-Semitism may have functioned in your childhood or how it functions in the community there today?
It's a question that I think about a lot, as we all do. I worry a lot about anti-Semitism and kind of feel that I'm in this constant state of like wondering like when it's going to happen, when will an attack happen to me in some way. I don't mean a physical attack necessarily, but more of a psychological type of attack. So I'm very concerned and thinking about it all the time. In the Cuban context, when I talk to family, friends, community about whether they've experienced or experienced in the past anti-Semitism in Cuba, and they tend to say no, that they didn't experience anti-Semitism directly. The only thing I've heard from some people say in the family is that they remember when they were in Cuba that people would call them Polaco or Polaka, which means a Polish person. It was kind of a way of saying, you know, you're not Cuban, you have this other identity that's Polish and that's Jewish. So I have heard that, but I don't know if that is necessarily anti-Semitism or just a tradition in Cuba of calling people by their ethnicities, because they'll also call you Blanca or they'll call you China or they'll call you, you know, all these different sort of ethnic labels. So it may be more a kind of ethnic labeling than actual anti-Semitism. So I think in my own experience, and I was asked this question recently, whether any of my book events have been canceled, and I haven't experienced that. I think part of what maybe makes people like me different is that we're moving back and forth between identities. So I'm often asked to be the Jewish person in the Latinx context, and then the Latinx person in the Jewish context. So I get invited to like a Jewish book festival, and I'm the Latina at the Jewish book festival, for example. But then maybe there's a Latino studies event, and I get asked to be the Jewish person at the Latino studies event. So I think it might be that because of this kind of fluidity of identity, I sort of don't get pegged as one thing. So I haven't experienced like any kind of brutal anti-Semitic thing myself, but definitely I'm concerned about what's going on in the general context, and obviously I'm aware that it affects me as it affects all Jewish people.
Thank you. I think it's a really, we're at a very crucial moment in our society here in the States and also around the world. And so I'm just grateful for your talking about your experiences growing up Jewish, growing up Cuban, and what that means now. And also kind of sharing about these experiences with our community. We don't often talk about the Cuban or the Juban community. That's a word that I grew up with very much. Cuba and Havana in particular looms large in the family. So I just want to thank you for sharing of your insights and your time with us so generously today. Thank you to Dr. Corona, and also a shout out to Barana Soman. She's the KHC's administrative coordinator, and she's been coordinating this webinar behind the scenes. Thank you both so much. And on behalf of the Kupferberg Holocaust Center, thank you to everyone who joined us today. We hope you stay safe and be well. Thank you.